Okay, so here we are. Where it's like to kind of recollect ourselves. Where were we? When the semester ended before Christmas. I hope you all. I haven't graded your blue books yet, so that's waiting for me later. But so we've had Paul had his third and final trial, and so we're picking up with chapter 27. With the beginning of his sea journey to Rome. So he has appealed to the emperor, and kind of the final verdict of the kind of imperial and Herodian authorities. Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor." So to the emperor he goes. So. See, that's I said. I'll let Ashton in here. And this this account, the sea voyage account, brings into play kind of a complex aspect of Luke's narrative. That is, in this chapter, scholars are kind of divided into two camps. Basically scholars like to be divided into two camps because that keeps conferences going, right? So you have like pro and con, and they're up there on the panel and they argue with each other, and there isn't a whole lot of middle ground except out here in the parish. So I'm here to bring kind of the moderate view to you. But in a sense, part of the issue here is that Luke seems to indicate that in verse 2, with his we language, so embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus. So this is, again, one of the we passages of Luke. So it seems like Luke is on the trip. So there's a threesome with Paul, Luke, and Aristarchus. So that seems to be kind of the group that is kind of heading out on the ship. And again, just to underscore, when in these days of prisoner transport, it's not like, so Paul is being transported at the cost of the empire, but not Aristarchus or Luke. Luke, and this is something for our modern brains, we have to wrap our heads around the fact that two friends of Paul would be able to buy tickets, if you will, on the ships that are carrying the centurion and the guard detail of Paul, and just kind of come along for the trip. We would tend to think like, hey, wait a second, I don't want any of your friends and associates coming with you, on this trip. They could try to spring you loose. But that was a normal procedure in these times, especially for a political prisoner like Paul. So Paul is not just your run-of-the-mill kind of bandit or murderer or something like that. Those folks get dispatched on the spot. But as a political prisoner, he's clearly been given some privileges in being able to bring along pals, bringing along kind of a very, kind of a reduced entourage with him. Off to Rome. So on the one hand, Luke is there. Seems to be say, I was there on this trip. On the other, the fact is that we'll read through basically tonight. We're going to get through the whole chapter. It's going to be because it's really just one long sea voyage. But as we read it, just to let you know that there are certain aspects of this sea voyage which were commonplace in the literature of the Greco-Roman world. Now you have to think of it, right? I mean, that Greco-Roman world is organized around the coast of the Mediterranean Ocean, right? So sea travel was something that was common. It was the lifeblood of the empire. So stories would be told about this sort of thing, right? So but there are several things that really is like, wow, very kind of stock, kind of stock happenings. It's almost kind of like when you watch an action movie, it's like, oh yeah, okay, now this is going to happen, and there's going to be an explosion, and they're going to jump out the window, and there's certain aspects of this trip, they're like, wow, that's really, and it's also in some ways like, one of my I remember when I was in in high school in cross country, my coach was a Marine Corps officer who had served in Vietnam. And when the movie Platoon came out, so to date myself, so this is, in the early to mid 80s. So when the movie Platoon came out, I asked my coach, I said, so coach, what do you think about the movie Platoon? And he said, well, basically, they've put into that movie every possible thing that could happen to a platoon in Vietnam, that all, basically everything that you could think of that would happen to a group of combat soldiers happens to that one platoon. He said it wasn't like that. Maybe one of those things in the movie might have happened to a platoon, but not all of those things. And in some ways, it's kind of the same with this story. It's kind of like a lot happens in this story. So there are some hypotheses. So one hypothesis is Luke is giving you the straight dope. This is exactly what happened and the way it happened on the trip to Rome. Another, and so that would be one end of that would be one pole of the spectrum. The other pole would be Luke made this whole thing up. So those would be the two poles. Like this is absolutely true. It happened exactly in this way, and Luke is an absolutely trustworthy narrator of events, or Luke just invented this whole thing to give you a little bit of kind of sea voyage spice in his narrative. The middle ground would be a lot of this happened, but Luke might have pulled in some things that happened on Paul's other trips. Remember that in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul has been traveling by sea quite a bit. And we know from his letter to the Corinthians, he mentions being shipwrecked twice. Like I've been beaten, I've received the 40-1 lashes, and I've been hungry, and I've been threatened with wild beasts, and I've been shipwrecked twice. So in his letters that we know, Paul is kind of narrating his own autobiography, he relates that he's been shipwrecked at least 2 times. And the fact is that shipwreck in this parlance doesn't mean that the ship was sunk. It's like a car accident. Like you can have a car accident and the car isn't totaled, right? It's not like the car bursts into flames every time someone has an accident. In the same way, you can have a shipwreck and not everybody drowns, the ship doesn't sink. It just means that you had a crash, right? And so remember also that, you remember where Paul and so many of the people from various churches where they prayed, they pray on the beach where all the boats are basically. So this isn't something like, like a big harbor, and, have ocean. So picking up, I think where we left off is that basically that Luke has recounted the essential. I think the timeline or the general outlines of this trip are reliable, and Luke may have added a couple incidents that may have happened from other journeys in kind of saying, I'm going to tell all of Paul's sea mishaps in chapter 27, right? Instead of having to relate all the various things that went wrong earlier in the story, which would be a more organized way to tell it, if you think of it that way. So let's go ahead and start with the journey. When it was decided that we were to set sail, for Italy, they transferred Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Adramyttium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. So this is a theme that is in throughout the New Testament, especially in the New Testament literature, of the friendly centurion. It's that, that in a sense they keep on bumping into friendly, open-hearted centurions, right? So all the way from Jesus's crucifixion to Cornelius, the centurion at Caesarea Maritima, that Peter converts his household, and now we have this centurion, Julius, who, in a sense, is able to kind of a moral and ethic, kind of like a good guy, if you will, and treats Paul kindly. So this is kind of the kindly face of Rome, which would be something that would be utterly alien to just, if you advance the clock just one more generation, you'd have a hard time finding a Christian who would think that a centurion would be a friendly guy who would treat you kindly. So this is kind of a brief window in the life of the church. And so he allows him to go to his friends to be cared for. And again, this is part of the kind of the ancient, kind of incarceration system that you get to, if your jailer's okay with it, you can go stay with your friends. While, go find some friends in town, go stay with them. I'll meet you back at the boat in the morning. You're released on your own recognizance and your own expense, and then you can come back. Which again is just so alien to what we would think of as being a prisoner. And then, so then putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. So the fact that they're getting on an Alexandrian ship is going to shape some of the major parts of this narrative. So why would an Alexandrian ship be a significant detail? Well, the ships from Egypt were taking the African grain to Rome. This was a fundamental this was a backbone of the Roman economy, bread and circuses and all that. Well, Italy did not grow enough wheat to feed the city of Rome. So the empire was basically supported by the wheat fields of Spain and North Africa that would be, and also the Nile. So then there's a lot of grain that was grown along the Nile basin, and that was all sent and imported to Rome. So an Alexandrian ship was a grain-bearing ship. That was the thing. And these things were massive. These were the super tankers of the ancient world. So later on, we're going to learn that there are 276 persons on this ship, which you might think, wow, that's a lot of people. This isn't a Galilean fishing boat, right? This isn't, Jesus, with 12 guys in a little boat on the Sea of Galilee. This is an enormous craft, right? And also what you would have this would be like the fastest way. In a sense, the centurion has found the express trip to Rome, because all these ships are all heading in one direction. They are all heading to Italy to offload their wheat for the Roman bread dole. And not only that, we know from historical sources, and this is going to come into play, that excuse me, that because the Mediterranean is very dangerous in the wintertime, that ship captains and the owners of the ships that were willing to send wheat shipments in the wintertime were paid at enormous bonuses. Basically, this would be the opposite. So there's a lot of risk, but huge reward if you manage to get your ship of grain from Africa to Rome in the winter season, when again, grain prices would be high. The best time to bring all your crop to market would be when nobody else has any food in the marketplace, right? That's when you can set your own prices, corner the market, all that good stuff. So we have the forces of ancient capitalism at work here. And Paul and his little retinue and the centurion and the soldiers are kind of take their part in this broader narrative. So they get on board the Alexandrian ship. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them. So again, this is another historical detail which again lends, in my judgment, lends credence to this part of the trip was real, that Luke is relating something that was happening. Luke has tracked so much of his narrative on the Jewish calendar of holidays. And so the fast was the ancient word for what we now know in America by our Jewish friends as Yom Kippur, right? The Day of Atonement. So back in Paul's day, it was simply called the fast. So, and the fast happened in wintertime. So you know that if the fast is already gone by, you're in the deepest part of the winter, in the stormy season. And so this is already a very dangerous trip. So Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our own lives." So you want to kind of bookmark that as Paul displays prophetic insight. That would be like, Paul has the Holy Spirit. Listen to him. This is like that part in like the horror movies where somebody says, "Hey, let's not go into the graveyard." And they're like, "Oh, the graveyard will be fine." And it's like, they always like, "No, listen to the guy who tells you not to go in the graveyard." So Paul is saying, "Hey guys, maybe we should just stay put right here." So the reason why I wanted you to know about the wheat shipments and the economy of the ancient world is you can understand why they will completely disregard Paul's advice, right? This is about money. This is about, they are here to make money. And if you sit there until the winter passes, not only are you going to lose your winter bonus, but then you're also paying all the costs of sitting there with your cargo, instead of delivering it to its destination. So the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said, which, if you think about it, would be a very natural thing for the centurion to do. It's like, "Paul, and who are you again? And what is your expertise in Mediterranean navigation?" So they totally disregard what Paul says, but they're going to be sorry. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was, and the majority means those three guys versus Paul. That's like a four. So the majority, it's not like they had a vote on the boat, right? This is like, "Hey, you guys want to go?" This is those four. The majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. Now, again, part of for the scholars who think that Luke is making this stuff up or is just simply copying stuff from other, Greek literature, the fact is that underneath the English here are very technical Greek words. So in a sense, Paul or Luke is displaying either that he borrowed a lot of this, or that he on the trip learned a lot of very technical vocabulary around sailing. So these words for weighing anchor and for the lee of the island, all these are very specific Greek words that don't occur anywhere else in Luke's writing, but only in this chapter. So it's kind of Luke is, I kind of think Luke is kind of showing off what he learned while he was on the trip. So kind of like as you pick up slang and when you go visit someplace, then you go impress your friends with the words all the things you learned. And so this is Luke impressing us. So they weighed anchor, began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind, in Greek, a typhe, where we get the word typhoon from. So a typhoon called the Northeaster rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat, and here the ship's boat is a lifeboat. So if you think, like sometimes you'll see this on yachts where they'll drag the dinghy behind the boat. So in a boat of this size, like an Alexandrian wheat ship, would have basically a little dinghy that they could row back and forth easily to the dock to, get off the boat and come back again. So they've got that dragging behind them. So basically this thing is whipping right behind the boat. And so they just are barely able to manage to get it under control and tie it down. Then finally, they basically hoist it up into the ship. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. Now, the Syrtis is actually, that's a section of the coast of North Africa, which was notorious in the ancient world for being basically a ship graveyard, that it's full of reefs and sandbars, and the idea is like if you wound up in the Syrtis, like it was game over. There's no way you can navigate your way out of that. So like if you're familiar with the Odyssey, some of this should be kind of ringing. It's like being driven by the wind, and letting yourself just simply being driven by the storm. So they were afraid that but what they do is they try to drop anchor and drag the anchors to try to slow themselves down, and so they don't get driven onto even shallower water. So they've basically been driven all the way from Crete. And again, remember, they don't have geolocation devices or satellite navigation. They're terrified that they've been driven all the way from where Crete is all the way to the coast of North Africa. And in their mind, this was a possibility that they could have been blown that far off course. So that's why they start dragging anchors. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day, they began to throw the cargo overboard. So again, if you know that this is an Alexandrian wheat ship, trying to sail on a bonus, you would know how desperate this situation is. Right, that they're throwing basically money over the side of the ship. The whole reason for their voyage. So this is really a very serious situation. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard, which again, that is desperation, defined. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest raged. That's for those of you who've been tracking the Acts of the Apostles, that's a classic Lucan litotes, no small tempest, right? It means a mighty tempest is what he's saying there, but that's a classic Lucan formulation. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. I mean, drama. It's like, they've lost all hope. So then it goes on. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me." I just love Paul. Good old Paul. He never passes up an opportunity to say, "I told you so." You should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And indeed, God has granted safety to all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island." So he saves the bad news for last. So it's like, hey guys, good news. We're all gonna live. Bad news, yeah, the whole thing, we're gonna lose everything else. So this would have been bad news to the ship's captain and owner indeed, but what Paul does is, there are a couple things that are going on in this paragraph where really you kind of, again, this is where Luke is bringing in kind of the Paul's opportunity to witness. Again, besides not missing an opportunity to say, "I told you so," Paul never misses an opportunity to speak about the God whom he worships, right? It's like there is no bad time for evangelization. And in the middle of the storm, hey, these guys are desperate. It's foxhole Christianity, people. So he said, hey, so this is when he's going to introduce the topic of the God whom he worships. And there's an Old Testament sea voyage narrative that I wonder if you remember, right? Jonah. So think of the narrative of Jonah. And Luke has written his narrative of Paul to flip the narrative of Jonah on its head. That is, the ship, in a sense, right, in the Jonah narrative, the ship is in danger because of Jonah. And they have to get rid of Jonah in order to save themselves. In Paul's journey, the people on the ship are going to be saved because of Paul, right? And they better keep Paul close to him, otherwise they're all going to go down. And it's, in a sense, in the Jonah narrative, it's the sailors on the boat who ask Jonah, who are you and where are you from and what God do you worship? You know, like, why is this happening to us? And then Jonah explains. In this narrative, it's just the opposite. Paul is going to volunteer about the God that he worships and tell, and this God who's going to give them hope in the midst of their despair. And that's a gospel message, right? This is in some ways, what Luke is doing here is he's also giving you a little kind of view of kind of the existential appeal of the gospel, right? That the gospel is to be preached when people are, you know, seasick and in despair. You know, like, you know, they haven't eaten anything for more than, you know, for not a few days. They're very hungry, they're in despair, and now is the time to speak about the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And so you have to imagine that, again, all the sailors have their own gods, right? And that's in the Jonah story. That, you know, all the sailors, they pray to their gods, and then they say to Jonah, hey, what God is at work? You know, what's, you know, have we missed something? And so you have to imagine all the sailors are praying to their gods. And so Paul is contrasting their gods to his God. And his God is going to guarantee their safety. And that's kind of the part of the kind of the monotheistic evangelical message that Paul brings to the pagan world. And again, we hear a phrase, do not be afraid, Paul. And that is, again, one of the messages for Luke that resounds throughout the theophanies of Luke. That is, the appearances of God in Luke, you know, more often than not, carry with them the phrase, do not be afraid. And that goes, you know, I mean, I preached on this several weeks ago about Mary, right? I mean, all the way back to the Annunciation to Mary, do not be afraid is a part of the message when God shows up. So, but then what Paul is able to do then is he says, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, which is almost an exact quote from the infancy narrative in Luke chapter 1, verse 45. Blessed is she who believed what had been told unto her, right? That's Elizabeth to Mary. So again, you have this wonderful evocation of as Paul is, or as Luke is getting to the end of his narrative, he's giving you kind of some throwback Thursdays to the very beginning of his narrative. He's like, yeah, remember when I wrote that? You know, it's like, remember chapter 1 of my gospel. So he's bringing up some stuff to say, this is one story about the God whom we all serve and the God whom we all worship. It's a God who speaks into the midst of our fears, in the midst of our mortality, in the midst of our vulnerability to death, and says, do not be afraid. This is the God that Luke has been telling us about literally from page 1, right? From the get-go of his gospel, he's been telling us about a God who says we are not to be afraid. Remember the song of Zechariah in that verse, that we might worship and serve him without fear, right? So that for Luke, one of the key spiritual effects of God and of spiritual qualities in worshipers of God is courage, is the absence of fear. And so God gives courage, and we are called to encourage others. And so you see, that's what Paul does. So that Paul, by saying, keep up your courage, he is giving to others what God has given to him, right? God has told him not to be afraid. And so he doesn't hold on to that as some sort of insider trading knowledge. He shares that. He shares the good news of their future and their salvation with his shipmates. And I think that's where again, Luke doesn't miss an opportunity to give Christians a moral lesson, in the midst of his narrative. And I think that's part of a key vocation of us as Christians. And remember, Luke isn't in the midst of a preaching mission here. He's in the middle of a storm with people who don't believe, right? He's just in other words, he's just kind of doing life. He's getting from point A to point B. And so as we get ourselves from point A to point B, in a sense, we are called to look for those opportunities in which we can share the courage that we've been given by our hope in Jesus and his holding us in the palm of his hand. We're called to give that to others. And even in a sense, even if they don't themselves become Christians, in a sense, our first gift is not necessarily faith sometimes, but courage. Right? Simply saying to others, you know what? There's another side to this. You know what? This isn't the end of the world. You know what? This is how I look at things. To be able to speak a word of hope, a word that encourages others, is a Christian evangelical vocation. Right? It is a speaking of the good news. So I think that's something that each of us can be called to think about in our own lives. How can we how can we share that message of courage with others? Who needs to be encouraged, kind of have courage planted in them? Have courage put right in their hearts. Think about that person and ask God to give you the wisdom and the courage to be an encourager of others who are having difficult times and are in despair. All right, so verse 27. When the 14th night, so again, this has been a 2-week storm. Right? So for 2 weeks, they've been buffeted by this. When the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. Now, this would be a terrifying prospect, right? So for a sailor on a boat, that you're in the middle of the night, you're being driven by a storm, and you think you're coming up on land, and which is usually a very deadly situation, right? You have big waves. That's where people die. Since as long as they can be driven by as long as they're floating and they can be driven by the wind, you're okay in the short term. But if there's land nearby and you're going to get driven onto that land, that is a crisis situation. So the sailors begin to kind of, we don't know if it's like, were there some land birds or something like that were flying that but something gave them the indication that they're nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. Now this is Luke's narrative art here. This is drama. So they found 20 fathoms. A little farther on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. This is classic. This is a classic sailor maneuver, right? It's like, hey, let's ditch these passengers and save ourselves. And so you just have to imagine that on this boat, right, they're like, oh yeah, we're all gonna go, all of us sailors, you guys stay right here. We're all gonna go up to the bow and we're gonna be lowering anchors from the bow. Nothing to see there. You all just kind of stay put and we'll be right back. We promise. And so what they actually do is they go try to get that lifeboat, that dinghy, and throw that into the water so they can get onto it and flee from the boat and head towards the land that they know is somewhere nearby, leaving all the landlubbers and the passengers to their own devices. This is actually reported as not infrequent behavior by sailors during storms in the Greek literature. Like, this is something that they would do all the time, like this is like they would hit the eject button and leave everybody else. It's kind of like Indiana Jones, where those two guys, the second movie where the two guys, they jump out of the plane and they leave Indiana to pilot the plane. This is a classic move. So Paul once again displays prophetic insight. And guess what? Good old Julius is a quick learner. This time he listens to Paul. And when Paul tells him, hey, you better get a hold of these guys because they're about to desert you and leave you high and dry. And so the centurion listens, and he grabs his soldiers, who were tough guys, and says, and basically, cuts the dinghy, throws that overboard, and says, okay, no parachutes. I mean, that's the equivalent of throwing all the parachutes off the plane. It's like, okay, we're all in this together. You've got to stay on board and help us. So that's again, it's a little bit humorous. This is kind of Luke, kind of the humorous drama of this situation, because we know it's going to turn out okay, right? So it's humorous, but of course it was very frightening, I'm sure, at the time. I note that, however, that Paul says, unless the men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. I mean, I think Paul's like, I'm going to be good because God told me so, so I don't know about you all, but, I'm going to be fine, but you all are in deep doo-doo if you don't stop these guys. So, good old Paul. It's like that second person, you're going to be in trouble. Don't you worry about me, though. So this is, in verse 33, this is one of my favorite phrases in the New Testament. It's just a short phrase, 3 words in English, just before daybreak. I love that. I mean, how much of our lives do we live just before daybreak, right? If we're, in a sense, I think as Christians, we're given the choice to live at midnight, at the hour of panic and desperation and save your own skin and every man for himself, or do we choose to live just before daybreak? Because once we see what Paul does here, I pray for the Spirit of God to empower me to live as a just before daybreak kind of person, right? And to get me out of my midnight frame of minds and get me to the hour before dawn, right? And that is, we as Christians, that's where we live. That's our sweet spot, is before the sun rises, but we trust in it, and we're going to lean into that dawn, right? We're going to lean into daybreak because that's who we are as followers of Jesus. So it's just such a great narrative turn, because things really will turn after this phrase. And this is actually, that's the verse that I used at St. Dunstan's in Houston when we had our first worship service on a Thursday at 10 a.m. After Hurricane Harvey went through. And so Hurricane Harvey came through on a Sunday morning, and we were all in our homes for basically 3 days. The whole, our part of Houston was flooded, and it was physically impossible for me to get to the church. All the roads to the church had been flooded. And so on Thursday, the water on Wednesdays, the water was pretty much receded. On Thursday, we knew we could have a service. So we sent out the word, Thursday, 10 a.m., we're going to give a service of thanksgiving that, as far as we knew, and it turned out to be true, that we hadn't lost any life in the parish, and that, and actually in the whole city of Houston, that there wasn't a single death because of Harvey in those 3 days. And so this was my text, was for that sermon, was just before daybreak. And so that, I felt like that's where we were as St. Dunstan's. So Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense. Now notice how that subtle difference. Look at verse 27. It's the 14th night. And Paul says, this is the 14th day. This is the Christian difference. This is the difference between a person of faith and a person without faith. A person without faith says, this is the 14th night. But Paul says, this is the 14th day. And, you know, can we look at our lives and count our lives in days and not nights? I mean, this is just such a, that little subtle thing. I just love this part of the story. It is that little subtle thing that Luke does there. But it's so important. It has so much spiritual value. So he says, today is the 14th day that you have been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive. For none of you will lose a hair from your heads. And that's the saying of Jesus. That's an echo from the sparrow. The Lord knows, he knows how many of the hairs of your head are numbered. So you won't lose a hair from your heads. After he said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. You know exactly what he's doing, don't you? Right? I mean, you can't get more evocative. I mean, Luke is saying he's celebrating the Eucharist. Right? And so just before daybreak, at that Easter hour, the hour of their deliverance, right, Luke is going to take his time to celebrate the Eucharist, right, to take bread, give thanks, break it, and eat it. Again, it's that same structure all the way from the multiplication of the loaves and fishes, right, and to the Last Supper. This is just a structure that indicates so that basically we can follow exactly what Paul is doing. And he began to eat, and then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. So in a sense, they're not participating in the Eucharist, but the fact that Paul, and you have to imagine also Aristarchus and Luke, but that the three of them, in the presence of all, basically they're going to sit down in the middle of this storm and share the Lord's Supper together and proclaim that there is day coming, right? You can't see it yet, but this is the sacrament of the coming dawn. And to sit down, that in and of itself is a witness to faith, right? And in some ways, I feel like, that's our Mass on the grass, right? I mean, it's kind of like in the midst of all the stuff that's happening in our society right now, across so many domains, that we're out there kind of doing our thing, breaking bread, taking it, eating it, in the sight of all, and so it has a witness that we are daybreak people. We are leaning into the dawn. And then all of them were encouraged. They took food for themselves. There were in all 276 persons in the ship. After they satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. So this is the final, okay, basically they threw over the cargo wheat. Now they're throwing over their provisions in order to make that boat as light as possible for the grounding. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. So at this point, Paul is relating to you a very complicated three-step maneuver that these sailors have to do to get them to safety. So first, they cast off anchors and leave them in the sea. So basically, you're cutting the ropes to your anchors. That's number one. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars. So in the middle of the storm, they tied down basically the rudder, which the steering oar, in order so that they wouldn't thrash around. So they just tie them fixed, so as they're being driven by the storm. So now you got to loosen those things so you can start to steer the ship. And then third, they hoist the foresail to the wind and make for the beach. So three things done, and this is a very, they all have to be done together so that you can get the maximum amount of momentum So, you know, cut anchors, raise the sail, free your rudder, and so that you can make a charge to try to run the ship up onto the beach. Now, you have to remember that most people in this time, you know, unless you're a sailor or you were fortunate enough to grow up on a place like the Sea of Galilee, most people couldn't swim, right? So that's why it was so critical for them to try to run that boat as far up onto the beach as they could, because if the ship broke, then if you were at least in hip deep water, you would have a chance of being able to kind of walk on the shore. But if it broke too far away, you know, you could be just a yard away from where you could stand, but you drown, right? So they're trying to get as far up onto that beach as they can. So so far so good. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck, or the bow stuck, and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken by the force of the waves. So this is the kind of worst case scenario. So what you have to imagine, I'm going to try to paint a picture of this beach for you in words here. But basically, what they've seen in the distance is the beach, and so they're hoping with the waves, you know, on that beach. But what they don't see is underneath the surface of water, there's a sandbar that separates the beach from the rest of the ocean. So you still have waves that are going over the sandbar, but you have a body of water that's deep in between the sandbar and the beach. That's basically a recipe for the death of everybody who can't swim on that boat, right? Is because there's no way for them to get to the sandbar. And now the waves from the ocean are pounding on the back of the boat, and as it gets driven deeper into the sand, and it's just a matter of time before the whole thing breaks apart. So this is a crisis. At this point, things are not looking good at all. The soldiers, but wait, Paul's going to have some quick thinking. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. It's good to have friends in high places sometimes. It's always good to be friends with your jailer. So whatever you have to do. So, but once again, this underscores the story about how, for the sake of Paul, everyone would be saved on that boat. So here, because of Paul, the centurion keeps them from killing everybody else, all the other prisoners on the ship. The centurion ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And thus it was that we were brought safely to land. And that's, you know, thus ends the story, right? And so, you know, in fulfillment of Paul's prophecy, right? Remember, this is, and Luke is all about prophecy fulfillment, right? And so to the end, you know, Paul, you know, Luke just can't, you know, this is just how he thinks. So Luke, sorry, sometimes I get him confused. So Paul says, we're all going to be saved, and we're going to lose the ship, but everybody's going to make it. And sure enough, the ship is destroyed, but everybody makes it onto that beach by just, you know, kind of the swimmers swim, everybody else just grabs a piece of debris and, you know, lets the waves carry them, and they all get driven onto the beach. And in the NRSV, again, it says, it kind of flattens it out. It says, and so it was that all were brought safely to land. But really, the Greek is much more formal. It really is like the ending of a story. It says, it really is, and thus it was that we were brought safely to land. And so, anyway, so that's the end of kind of the sea voyage. You know, I also, again, as a kid, I remember, you know, Robinson Crusoe and, you know, the various stories, the pirate, there's the pirate, and it's about, they had the peg leg, and there's the one, it's a Jim, yeah, I can't remember, but it says, someone typed me, I can't remember, but anyway, but you remember the story. It's like, you know, I don't know if kids know those stories anymore, but let's see. And so, yeah, Treasure Island, thank you, Long John Silver, yes. So they Treasure Island, and the sailors, trying to save their own skins and doing nefarious things to the poor unsuspecting passengers. It's all in there, but through the midst of it all, I just love how Paul is really exemplifying for us, what a Christian journey through kind of this sort of life is all about, and how we're supposed to conduct ourselves in the midst of those who don't believe. And it's to be encouragers, and to be those who live just before daybreak, right? And it says Paul and all those sailors had the same experience of that trip, right? They all had they're all on the same boat, literally. But how do you interpret your own experience? Do you interpret your experience in terms of the night or the day, in terms of death or new life? And that makes all the difference in the world. So it's just, is it just a sea voyage, account? On the one hand, yes, but on the other, there's so much that is going on in it. Okay, so we have a few minutes, and so Erica asked, so what is going on with the rest of the apostolic leaders and the growth of the church during the Paul saga? So the short answer is, we wish we knew. we don't have a good idea about what on earth was going on in the rest of the church. And that's one of the things, is that really this is our source. And it's basically the New Testament and Josephus are really very bare sources for what was going on in Judea. And in terms of the Greco-Roman world, we have very little idea, because again, the Christian communities were poor, and they were small, and they were hidden. And so we just have some tantalizing details. We know that, for example, as I mentioned in the chapter about Corinth, that the proconsul, he was a real person. And so we have these sorts of independent verifications that the people that Luke describes Paul bumping up against lived in history. But we just don't have any sense of, beyond the thread of this narrative, what was going on around it. We just don't know. It takes really nearly a century to have a good idea before you really start gaining an archaeological record of Christian communities that generate enough archaeology for scholars to be able to get a sense of what was life like for these Christians, how many of them were there. We just know barely from the Roman sources. Once they start persecuting Christians, they become a matter of state. So we know from the Roman side that these horrible Christians, were in Rome, and and you had kind of Rome has the kind of the New York Times Square back before it was Disneyfied. It's kind of like everything horrible in the world winds up washing up in Rome, in the capital, and here are these Christians. They're just one more thing that our empire has washed up in this capital. But other than that, we don't have a whole lot. So that's really that's one of the things, is everything is very hypothetically reconstructed outside this narrative.